Daniel chapter 7 is where we pick things up tonight as we continue our journey through the Bible. The 12 chapters of the book of Daniel divide themselves evenly in terms of the themes of the book. The first 6 chapters of the book are historical. We have studied those. It's important to remember that Daniel wrote this book inspired by the Holy Spirit 2,500 years ago. It's very easy just to pick it up and read it. We see the fulfillment of most of the chapter already historically and the rest of it being fulfilled before our very eyes. And we can lose just the sense of awe that God would prophesy concerning the future before the events took place. The last half of the book of Daniel, chapters 7 through 12, are prophetic. God basically giving us the history of the world in advance, the history of man's empire and his government until God brings an end to it and establishes his reign. And so Daniel gives us this history of the world right down to the end, and that's the theme that we'll be looking at in the remainder of the book. Daniel writes this, we're told in verse 1, and the first year of Belshazzar, he receives this vision or this dream of chapter 7, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. And the first year of King Belshazzar was probably 553 BC. It was 14 years before Babylon would fall to the Medes and the Persians, which we saw a couple of chapters ago in our study of the Word of God. Chronologically, the events that occurred in Daniel's life in this receiving of the prophecy fits between Daniel chapter 4 and Daniel chapter 5. So it helps to answer a little bit of a question for us as God shows Daniel man's history all the way to the end, and that it isn't going to be worth 2 cents, and that the Babylonian Empire was going to come to nothing just like all of the other empires, that when Belshazzar offered Daniel the third place in the kingdom and the robe and the golden chains and all that kind of stuff, that why Daniel, it was so easy for Daniel, among other reasons, to just say, nah, you go ahead and forget it. You keep it. It's not going to be worth having. You're not going to be around long enough. And of course, that was the night before the empire fell. And so that's the timing of it here. The first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. Daniel had a dream, visions of his head while he was on his bed. So you ever find that God does a lot of speaking to you when you're about to fall asleep or trying to fall asleep, or you're some of us don't have a problem with that, but I mean when you're trying to work through something between you and the Lord, it's kind of churning and churning and churning. Sometimes He really can give you some great things at that time of the day or the night. I keep a pad and a pen right next to the lamp right there and write things down sometimes as the Lord gives them to me. And so here he is. He's trying to go to sleep, but he gets this vision, and then he wrote down the dream, telling the main facts of the dream. And Daniel now gives the vision that came to him. Daniel spoke, saying, I saw a vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. And so you see this great sea, the image of it put before our mind, the 4 winds of heaven. These winds, we don't know exactly what they are, but they're evidently from heaven, as is declared there. Some working of God upon this sea, churning up the sea. The sea is unstable. It's a stormy sea. And so you have the 4 winds of heaven stirring up or working on this great sea. The tendency sometimes is to look at that great sea and say, that's talking about the Mediterranean Sea because that was the great sea of that part of the world, but it doesn't fit really with the rest of the passage. Many times in the Scriptures, and especially in the prophetic passages in the Bible, a sea is used to symbolically denote humanity, the mass of humanity, the sea of humanity, or the nations of the world. Jesus himself, he spoke of this in one of his parables in Matthew 13, and he said, the kingdom of heaven is like a dragnet that was a dragnet that was cast into the sea, gathered some fish of every kind, which when it was full they drew to the shore, and they sat down, gathered the good into the vessels, but threw the bad away. And so it will be at the end of the age, the angels will come, separate the wicked from among the just, and cast them into the furnace of fire, and there will be wailing and gnashing of teeth. And so here you have the sea, the net being taken across the sea, the fish being gathered, all of it representing humanity. Jesus used the image himself. In the book of Revelation, John, inspired by the Holy Spirit, Revelation chapter 17, verse 1, and we'll be crossing back and forth into Revelation and Daniel all through the night. The books are tied to one another. If you're a note taker in your margins or whatever, you'll find it handy for making heads or tails of this a little bit later. But in Revelation chapter 17, verse 1, the nations of the world are described as being many waters or being a body of water. There's the great harlot that is spoken of there, and speaking of the religious harlot of Rome during the Great Tribulation. And one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and talked with John, saying to John, "Come, and I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters." And then the interpretation of it is in verse 15 of that same chapter 17. And then the angel said to John, "The waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues." And so it is identified in the Scriptures very, very often as being the sea of humanity. It's clearly identified for us in the very chapter that we're in chapter 7, verse 15, where the angel speaks in verse 17, where the angel speaks there and says to Daniel, "Those great beasts which are four kings which arise out of the earth." And so these great beasts are going to come out of the sea, and here the angel interprets it in verse 17 that they're coming out of the earth, they're coming out of this mass of humanity. And so he declares in verse 3 that four great beasts come up out of the sea, out of this mass of humanity, each different from the others. And what Daniel is going to describe here are four great beasts that represent the four world empires that were going to follow Daniel from Daniel's time, Babylon, all the way down to the end. This vision of Daniel chapter 7 corresponds with the vision that was given to Nebuchadnezzar and interpreted by Daniel in Daniel chapter 2, where you had this giant image, and it had a head of gold, and it had a chest and arms of silver, it had a belly and thighs of bronze, and it had legs of iron, and its feet were made up of iron and clay. In that image, you have four metals. You have four metals that are there, representing four kingdoms. And the feet and the toes, which represent a last day confederation of 10 countries, it comes out of the Roman Empire, but God sees that Roman Empire as still existing and a resurrection of it in the last days. So you have four metals in chapter 2. Now you have four beasts. Now the interesting thing is the vision that was given, at least it is to me. In this image that is given to Nebuchadnezzar, God gives Nebuchadnezzar this beautiful image that's put before him. Fabulous in its proportion, fabulous in its structure and all. And so that's kind of how Nebuchadnezzar saw the world-ruling empires of the world as this beautiful masterpiece, this work of art. Now you get to Daniel chapter 7, and God gets to describe man's rule in the figure of speech how he sees it, and he uses the images of savage beasts. Can you imagine what this earth looks like to heaven? My wife tells me about an article in Newsweek this week that I didn't even have time to get to. The whole article is on the cover, an article on stress. I was too stressed to get to it even this week. This is my life, I'm telling you. But anyway, there's the story several months ago in which there was this man and woman, elderly, who would walk in through Central Park, I believe was the park. They would split at a certain point, and they would just be by themselves for a while by the park. They split off. She didn't come to their rendezvous point. He went to find her, and they found her not only dead, but completely disemboweled in the park. You pick up the newspaper this week. 2 German tourists in Atlantic City. They spend the night in a $36 a night room. And they come to find out after having spent the night in the room, there was a dead body in the box spring. That give you the willies for the rest of your life every time you go to bed? I mean, I always check under the bed and that kind of thing when I go there. I never check the box spring. But can you imagine what God, when He looks at this earth, and He looks at the corruption, He looks at the abuse of power, He sees just the trail of victims all over the world, how He sees it. And He sees it as savagery. He sees it as beasts. And He's talking about the government of man and the empires of man. And so here are the 4 beasts corresponding to the 4 metals of the image there in Daniel chapter 2. And each one of the beasts was different from one another. He describes, you notice in verse 4, the first beast, and he said it was like a lion, and it had eagle's wings. I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it. This first beast is speaking of the Babylonian Empire, which was still in place at the time that Daniel receives this vision. In the excavations of the city of Babylon and the Babylonian Empire, one of the images that they ran into continually was the image that's used here, the image of a lion. And you would walk along their great promenades that they would have, the great streets that they had, to their, high places within the city, and all along there would be this carving of the lions all of the way. It was a symbol of Babylon. But notice as God looks at it, it was like a lion, but it had eagle's wings. And eagles, the wings of an eagle, speaking of swiftness. The Babylonian Empire came to conquer the world in that day the way that most empires conquered the world, and that was with tremendous swiftness. Both the lion and the wings of the eagle speak of an empire that moves quickly in its conquest. And the Babylonians conquered the world very swiftly. So you have the head of gold in chapter 2. Here you have the lion, which speaks of comparable supremacy, the lion being the king of beasts, and so corresponding between the two. Interesting, while Daniel's looking at this lion that has eagle's wings, again a symbol of ancient empires, the wings are yanked off of the lion. They're plucked off, and then this lion was lifted up from the earth, was made to stand on 2 feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. In other words, what you have is this lion being converted into a man. You've got a conversion that's happening in this image. What happened to Nebuchadnezzar? There was a conversion that occurred. He was an animal. In his ruling over that empire, God humbled him because he would not give God the glory for the great empire that God had put together. And so for 7 seasons he lived as a wild man, and at the end of it he came back an entirely different man, a humble man. He had the heart of a man inside of him. All of it speaking of the Babylonian empire. And the conversion that occurred in Nebuchadnezzar's life. Then in verse 5, suddenly there was another beast. He moves to the second of the 4, and it was like a bear. And it was raised up on one side. I assume that's a bad sign. And had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said thus to this bear, arise, devour much flesh. So the appearance of this second beast is one of a bear. It represents the Medo-Persian Empire that followed the Babylonian Empire. One of the interesting things is you got a bear here, but no wings. And so you don't have any swiftness about this empire. A bear is not necessarily the swiftest thing, though it's swifter than us. As the old joke goes, there's 2 guys up in Antarctica or something, and they're walking along on the ice and everything, and one of the guys pulled off his binoculars, looked out there, and there is a polar bear running toward them. They start to run for their life. And as they're running, the one guy looked over at his friend and said, listen, what are we running for? We can't outrun a polar bear. He said, I'm not going to outrun the polar bear. I'm going to outrun you. And so that's the way. But compared to a lion, it's a pretty swift, slower kind of beast. And so this was a characteristic of the Medo-Persian Empire. It was a ponderous empire in terms of its movement, how it obtained its objectives. Speed was unimportant to the Medo-Persians. What they tried to do was to defeat the world just with sheer force. They would simply crush their adversaries with numbers. Their means of conquering was so inefficient, but they didn't care. At one time, when they went to war late in the kind of high point of the Medo-Persian Empire, they would simply, as they conquered all of these other nations, they would take the able men of those nations and then made them the front runners of their armies, and then followed by the Medo-Persians themselves. It was a common tactic in ancient times and not so ancient times to throw these other guys out in front and let them waste their ammunition killing all these people. Who cares about them anyway? They're not Medes and Persians. And then you throw the good troops into the battle. It's always been that way. And so there was a point, at one point in which the Medo-Persians entered into the battle against Greece with 56 nations aligned with them, 56 groups of men that they threw at the Grecian Empire or at Greece in an attempt to conquer Greece before they even brought their troops into bear. The way that the Medo-Persians went to war and moved their troops, it was like just this big lumbering bear. When they would go to war, they'd take their families with them. It wasn't a thing if we're going to go, no Desert Storm kind of a thing, going to go in and do something and get right back. They'd take their families with them. They knew it was going to be a long time. And Xerxes, when he went out to go against Greece, he went out with 300,000 men, 300 ships against Greece. He was defeated. But it gives you an idea of the size of the force. But that wasn't even the largest force that the Medo-Persians used. When Darius began to move through Scythia, he brought with him an army of 750,000 men with him. And their families, not counting the 600 ships that he went forward with. When Xerxes went against Greece, he took his total force that he took with him were 2,500,000 troops. It didn't look like an army. It looked like a whole nation on the move. And that's the way they move. They move like a bear. And you either wipe them out on the way to your land, but once they got close, like a bear would get close, forget it. It's going to crush you. And that was the way that they brought themselves, handled themselves in battle, very much like the image that Daniel gives here. Now, Daniel gives this image of the Medo-Persians 14 years before they even exist as a world-ruling empire. So again, the prophetic element, we look and say, well, yes, of course they did that. I read that in my history books. There were no history books for Daniel. He's looking out ahead into time, and God is prophesying of what is going to come. You notice that the bear is raised up on one side. We get a better interpretation of what this means later in chapter 8. The Medo-Persian Empire, they were united in their empire, but the Persians were the far stronger of the two. And so later it'll be represented as two horns, one being a greater horn than the other horn being broken off. Here you have one side of the bear higher than the other, and in prediction of the fact that the Medo-Persian Empire would be a united group of the two, but the one would be greater than the other. And then we see that it has the three ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And when the Medo-Persians took over the world, taking over the Babylonian Empire, they conquered three major areas: Babylon in the east, Egypt in the south, and the Lydian Empire in Asia Minor. And so all of this prophesied here in the imagery that God gave to them here. And the command was given to this great bear, arise, devour much flesh. And so they did. And then the third empire. After this, verse 6, I looked and there was another like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. Now, one thing, you'd look at a leopard and go, boy, a leopard doesn't need any help with speed. They're already so speedy. But here is, speed upon speed here. You've got a leopard with 4 wings of a bird, and the beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. And this leopard represents the Grecian Empire. A leopard was very, very a swift animal, and the Grecians were known for the swiftness with which they conquered the world. Within 13 years, Alexander the Great conquered the known world. Unreal that he could do that so quickly. And boy, did he make the Persians pay a price for coming against the Greeks in Greece. But he conquered that entire part of the world all the way to India and did it in 13 years. It was a swiftness of ancient military armies that was unparalleled how quickly he did it. He did it so quickly that he was disappointed at the age of 33 that there were no more empires to conquer. He was bummed. And it ended up kind of being the death of him. There are some people, they're born to move forward. And they like to go forward, and then they like to leave what's behind them to the administrators. And so you've got your visionaries and you've got your administrators. And they're both needed. They both need each other. But he took and he conquered the whole world, and then he didn't know what to do with himself at the age of 33. And historians tell us that in that condition, one winter day he got himself drunk, and staggering home, he apparently passed out or spent too long in the cold and in the rain, contracted pneumonia or some comparable disease, and died at the age of 33. And again, weeping that there was no more of the world to conquer. Now, it's interesting here, as he gives this image of double speed, the leopard with the 4 wings. The beast, he said, also had 4 heads. When Alexander the Great died at the age of 33, nobody expected him to die. Nobody expects a 33-year-old to die, especially when he's conquered the world and he's the king. You kind of look out for those guys. And so, when he died at the age of 33, they hadn't planned a replacement for him. There was no grooming of a leader to follow him. And so the Grecian Empire, following his death was carved into 4 pieces, and each of the 4 pieces were given over to one of each of his 4 main generals. And so you see it prophesied of here and spoken of symbolically in chapter 6. Again, astounding prophecies that God gives here. And then in in verse 7, I'm trying to get out of this chapter, but I'm not. These are verses. And after this, verse 7, I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. I don't want to ever meet this animal with huge iron teeth. Now, you notice that speaking of the iron teeth takes us back to the vision in chapter 2, where the Roman Empire was symbolized by the legs of iron. And so you have the same imagery that's being used here. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all of the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. And so you have this 4th beast representing the Roman Empire. The interesting thing about Daniel here is he looks at whatever he sees this beast is, representing the Roman Empire. He has nothing comparable in the animal kingdom to bring forward. It's unlike anything he's ever seen, unlike any of the other beasts. And so he describes it the best that he can. And so the Roman Empire, of course, was exceedingly strong. It did produce dread in its enemies and terror in her enemies. The Roman Empire is one of the most astonishing portions of the history of the world. It dominated the world, utterly dominated the world for almost 1,000 years, certainly for 500 to 700 years. Here we are, a country of just slightly over 200 years. And we haven't dominated much for long. And I wouldn't bet a nickel on how long anything will happen. So you get an idea of how hard it is for a nation to conquer that significant portion of the world that it did, and then to maintain its power for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And yet it did. And Rome was a ruthless empire. It was concerned about its empire. It brought peace to that part of the world. A lot of people were happy to have Rome come in and conquer that part of the world, so these marauding bands of robbers and all wouldn't come through, but they paid a price for that peace. Rome ground their subjects to powder. All that mattered was Rome. And so I was visiting in a hospital here recently, and I was visiting in the hospital there. There was the husband of the wife that I was visiting. He's Italian, and he warned me to go easy on the Romans in my teaching here. And so they were a vicious, cruel, terrible, the worst beast that the world has ever known. But they were, and I mean, they went in and hey, it's right here in the Bible. Don't hassle me related to this kind of thing. Use guys. Come on. But they went in, they conquered Sicily about 200 years, 212 BC. Then they took the north of Africa. And then they took Israel and that area of Palestine in about 70 or 90 BC. Then they took Syria. Then they took Germany. They took Switzerland. They took everything all the way up into England. And then their power began to falter in the 400 AD region. But they had grown very slowly over a period of hundreds of years, and their power diminished over a longer period of time. But they were a tremendous, tremendous empire, unlike any other empire before it. And they ruled much longer than all of the other empires together. The Babylonian Empire ruled for 70 years. Only 70 years. The Medo-Persian Empire ruled for 200 years. The Grecian Empire for 180 years. And then Rome comes in and rules 500, 600, 700 years at its zenith. And then ultimately it was driven back to its original borders in the 1400s. And so here is this speaking of this Roman Empire. And in the context of dealing with Rome, just as with the legs of iron in chapter 2, he talks about the fact that this beast had, different from the other beasts at the end of verse 7 that were before it, and it had 10 horns. And in the scriptures, the horns are a symbol of power. And these 10 horns correspond to what? In chapter 2, that image, the 10 toes of that image corresponding with Nebuchadnezzar's image. And so our attention is drawn no longer now to that fourth beast, but now to the 10 horns of that image. And you notice that those 10 horns, just as was the case with the 10 toes of the feet there in Daniel chapter 2, they don't represent a fifth empire. They represent a resurrection, so to speak, of the fourth empire, of the old Roman Empire. And so this identification of this beast and its existence then, but also its existence in the last days as you bring other scriptures together. In Revelation chapter 13, it's a good place to write it there in your margin. God speaks there through John and his vision, and he sees this same beast, as John said, "Then I stood at the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns." And so he takes this image of the 10 horns and speaks about it, representing 10 kings in the last days. And so in all of the cases throughout the Bible, these 10 horns speak of the same thing. They speak of an end-time reappearance of the Roman Empire, but in a new form. Everywhere you see it in the Scriptures. And so Roman Empire is going to be revived, and it's going to have 10 horns. That is, it's going to have 10 kings. And then notice in verse 8, I was considering the horns. There's Daniel. He's thinking about these horns. 10 horns? That's weird. 10 horns? What kind of animal has 10 horns? And as he's watching these 10 horns, there was another horn. So now you've got another horn here. And it's a little horn. And it came up among the 10 horns, before whom 3 of the first 10 horns were plucked out by the roots. And there in this horn, as he's looking at this little horn, it had eyes like the eyes of a man, and it had a mouth speaking pompous words. Here you have a picture of the Antichrist in the last days. This little horn comes up among the 10 horns, roots out 3 of the horns by the roots. And so in the last days, as the Bible speaks about a 10-country confederation being in existence, that the Antichrist will take over in the last days, a 10-country confederation in the region of the old Roman Empire. We see something that looks very suspicious to us as it relates to all of this. And the European community, doesn't matter that there's about 14 nations in it now, doesn't take anything for them to realign or to merge together or what. They're going to end up with 10. And when they end up with 10, it appears that 3 of them aren't really hip to what the Antichrist is wanting to do in terms of taking over their power or their authority. So he just comes up and he pulls them up by the roots, and however he does it, everyone goes, okay, he's our leader. And you wonder what could make these countries turn over their sovereignty to the Antichrist. Something's going to happen that's going to cause them to do that. And so this is a picture of the Antichrist. He's referred to as the little horn all the way through the prophetic scriptures and also in the book of Revelation. You notice that this little horn, it has eyes like a man. It has a mouth that spoke pompous words. It's got a big mouth, this Antichrist, and he is going to have a big mouth, and he speaks a lot against God. And so he's going to have human characteristics that we see here. Can you imagine living in a world where the people will fall for a leader that just says great things, pompous things? I can't either. Where a person knows how to give a speech, knows how to tell people what it is that they want to hear, and that the whole world will follow a person like that. That's exactly what the Antichrist is going to do. He's going to be very good, by the way, because he is going to be possessed by the devil himself. Not demon-possessed. He is going to be possessed by Satan himself. This guy is going to flash like you can't believe. And so, but you don't have to believe it because you're not going to be here if you know the Lord. So you leave that to him. But this is the way that things are going to be. It is fascinating to me that this little empire that the Antichrist puts together with that confederation of nations there in Europe or in that old Roman Empire is that he is going to, initially it's going to be an economic kind of empire. He is going to give it real distinction economically. And you're going to have the kind of situation where the world's going to look at him and say, I don't care if he's possessed by the devil himself. The economy's good. And that is exactly what's going to happen. If such a thing could happen. I'm not saying that it could ever happen. But that is the way. So, one of the things that's interesting, and I'm not taking cheap shots at anyone, I'm taking real shots, because the fact of the matter is that you got to look at where things are at and what people are willing to overlook today for what price. And everywhere you look in the world today, you see this thing is set up from one end to the other. And it's set up not only spiritually, not only geopolitically, not only in all of these different things. It is set up socially and where people are thinking today. They're set up for the one that's coming. Jesus said, listen, I came, you wouldn't accept me, another one will come in his own name, him you will receive. And he was speaking to the Jews about the Antichrist. Once you reject the truth, once you reject God, once you reject his Son, all you have are lies to believe in. And that's all that's coming their way with the rejection of God. And so the setup is so complete that we see all around us today. Now listen, you've got to stop slowing me down. We've got to get through this whole thing here tonight. Nothing needs to really change. Everything is already there, just the way. Now, just when you're about to pull your hair out, not your horns, pull your hair out, related to all of this kind of stuff that's going on here, all of a sudden Daniel gets a vision of the real throne. Now God just is going to tell him now, listen, this whole thing, this whole beastly thing of man, listen, don't get too carried away with all of that. Keep your eyes on heaven. Keep your eyes on God. And Daniel said, I watched till thrones were put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated. And so this is speaking of God the Father. He was seated in heaven, and he's being seated in what is essentially a courtroom. He's going to judge the earth here, and he's going to judge this beast, this little horn, in just a couple of verses. And so here is the Ancient of Days God. He's seated. He's not up there. He's not on any kind of nitroglycerin tablets. He's not frantic at all about anything that's going on in the world. He told us 2,500 years ago that it would be this way, you know. And it's a good thing he did, because I need to know all this stuff, given my personality. So here they are. The thrones are put in place. The Ancient of Days is still seated on his throne. They haven't moved him from his throne or anything like that. He's not pacing or anything like that. No foghorn, leghorn, nothing like that going on. His garment was white as snow, speaking of his holiness. The hair of his head was like pure wool, and we assume that that speaks of his wisdom. And his throne was a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire. This again is the image of the burning throne that is on wheels, and we studied that in the book of Ezekiel chapter 1 when we studied there. Here's the throne of God surrounded by fire, judgment, refining, purity, hip hip hooray. And there's a fiery stream that issued and came forth before him. 1,000 thousands ministered to him. So in this heavenly scene that's being described here, there's 1,000,000 that are ministering to him. And then 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. That's 100 million. And then we see elsewhere in the scriptures, plus thousands of thousands, this sea of people that are before the Lord in heaven at the time that he brings forth this judgment. This judgment, well, let's get to it, and then we'll talk about it. And so here they are. The court was seated. God's there in judgment. You've got a court, and the books were opened. And so God opened up the books. And Daniel said, I watched because the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking. And this Antichrist is blaspheming God all of the time. And Daniel said, I watched till the beast was slain and its body destroyed and given to the burning flame. And so here is God in his place of judgment, and he judges the Antichrist. And the Antichrist both he and his empire are destroyed. You might write in your margin there, Revelation chapter 19, verse 20, following the battle of Armageddon, when the Lord returns at the second coming of Christ. He wipes out the human enemies that are against him there, gathered together against him there in Armageddon. And then we're told in Revelation 19, verse 20, that the beast was captured, and with him the false prophet who worked signs in his presence, by which he deceived those who received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped his image. And these two, that is the Antichrist, otherwise known as the beast, and the false prophet, were cast alive into the lake of fire burning with brimstone. And so here is the judgment of the Antichrist, and Daniel sees it happen. And then you notice he says at the end of or in verse 12, as for the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. And so the Babylonian Empire ended. And so the empire ended, but in essence it continued as a part of another empire. And then the Medo-Persian Empire ended, but it continued as a part of the Grecian Empire. And so it was. They did not have the distinct, hard, immediate end that this fourth empire was going to have, and the leader of that empire, the Antichrist, was going to have, as is described in the Scriptures. And so we have this wonderful picture of the Ancient of Days, of God the Father, judging now the earth, judging the Antichrist, and now having judged the Antichrist, He's going to turn the rule of the earth over to His Son, and that brings us to verse 13. I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. And this Son came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought Him near before the Ancient of Days. And then to Him, that is the Son, was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve Him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and His kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed. And so here's this one like the Son of Man, a title used continually in the Gospels as it relates to the Lord Jesus. And then it speaks of this Son of Man in verse 13 coming with the clouds of heaven. As the religious leaders were interrogating Jesus on the morning of His crucifixion, He was keeping silent before them. Mark tells us in Mark 14, verse 61, for your note takers. He wouldn't speak to the high priests that were interrogating Him. The high priest asked Jesus and said to Him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus spoke to that high priest and He said, I am. And then He said, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven. And Jesus was referring to this prophecy in Daniel, and they knew it. They knew that Jesus was ascribing to Himself the fact that He was the Messiah and that He was the Son of the Father, referring Himself back to this place. In Revelation chapter 1, verse 7, we're told concerning the Lord Jesus, behold, He is coming with clouds, and every eye will see Him, and they also who pierced Him. In the book of Acts, you remember when Jesus was ascending into heaven, the disciples had been given orders to go back to Jerusalem and wait for the baptism of the Holy Spirit, and they just stood there watching after Jesus had left up there. And finally, I don't know how long they waited, but finally one of the angels kind of cleared his throat and said to him, listen, what are you guys doing looking up into heaven? This same Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven will come in like manner as you saw Him go into heaven. And so all of these things pointing to the fact that this is Jesus returning and establishing His kingdom. And this kingdom is going to be given. All peoples, all nations, all languages are going to serve Him. As Paul wrote to the church at Philippi, that at the name of Jesus, every knee is going to bow, of those in heaven and of those on the earth and those under the earth, that every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God the Father. And so His dominion is going to be set. These world empires, the government of man, is going to come to an end, and it's going to come to an end by the establishment of God's kingdom, which again brings us back to Daniel chapter 2, where that rock that was cut not with hands struck the image in the feet, and then the image crumbled to dust, the wind blew it away, not a trace of it was left, and then that stone which speaks of Jesus Christ the rock grew into and filled the whole earth, speaking of His reign. So here His second coming and establishing His kingdom upon the earth. And it's good for us to know, Daniel needed to know it, that there is a final world-ruling empire that's going to happen on planet earth, and it's going to be God's. It's going to be God's. He is going to rule this world. He is going to do it. And when He does it, nobody is going to wrest His power away from Him. And I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit, within my body. This was the effect of the dream upon him. And the visions of my head, they troubled me. And I came near to one of those who stood by, and I asked them the truth of all of this. And he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things, probably talking to an angel. And then the angel gives the interpretation. Those great beasts, which are four kings, and thus hence over kingdoms, which arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. When Jesus Christ returns, sets up His kingdom, we will rule with Him. No longer will this world be a place of opposition or persecution. It will be a place very friendly to us who know the Lord and love the Lord. And so there's the interpretation. The whole chapter would end there in verse 18 if it weren't for Daniel's curiosity. And Daniel said, "Then I wish to know the truth about that fourth beast, which was different from all of the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its nails of bronze." So he throws in some bronze nails here too that he saw that he kind of left out before. And so he's got nails of bronze which devoured, broke in pieces, and trampled the residue with its feet. And he was curious also about the 10 horns that were on the head, and especially about that other horn that came up, before which the 3 fell, namely that horn which had eyes and a mouth that spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows. So this is his question. What's the whole deal with that whole thing? And Daniel said, "I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints and prevailing against them until the Ancient of Days came, and a judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom." All of this happening at the second coming. During the Great Tribulation period, that 7-year period where God pours His wrath out upon planet Earth, the Antichrist is going to be given the ability to, as spoken of here, to fight against, to make war against the saints and to prevail against them. Now, when people read that kind of thing, they go, "Oh no, I didn't even know I was going to be in the Great Tribulation, let alone that the Antichrist was going to wipe me out." What it's right here. But one of the things, when you look at Revelation chapter 6, where the seals start to be broken, starting the tribulation period, that 7-year period, the first seal that's broken is the unveiling of the Antichrist. And at the end of chapter 6, the declaration that is made by the inhabitants of the earth is that the judgment that has come upon the earth is the wrath of the Lamb. It's the wrath of God being poured out, beginning with that first seal. The Bible teaches that we as God's children are not appointed to wrath. We must be gone before His wrath is poured out. Hence, we must be gone before the revelation of the Antichrist. So save your $6 or whatever when the next book comes out that reveals the Antichrist and all of that, and put it towards something worthwhile. And instead of doing that, we're going to be gone before that happens. The only way you can hold a post-tribulation view, and here I'm risking really offending perhaps some of you that are visiting here, is you must spiritualize the book of Revelation, which you don't want to do because there's warnings at the end as it relates to that. But there is going to be a number of people without number who are going to be saved during the Great Tribulation. But they will give their life for their faith because they will not take the mark of the beast in order to eat or supply for their family, that kind of thing. It is those saints that He will make war against and that He will prevail against them. Much better to come to know the Lord tonight. I mean, fly first class. Don't get stuck back there by the bathrooms, and go through all. Why? It doesn't make any sense. Now, if a person's in there and whatever, and then you got to get saved, you got to get saved. But don't wait till then. Get saved tonight. Take communion with us tonight, and we will get to it. And but don't wait until that time. It's a much rougher way to go. But the rapture will occur. Many of us will be gone. People will go, they were talking about that. I can't believe it now. And they'll give their life to the Lord. And whoever takes this church. The first Sunday we're gone, if you're here, come on, it'll be a bad scene. But I have a pretty good PA, and this will hold up the first 3.5 years. After that, nothing holds up against those hailstones that come down and all of that. And so you can have anything you want around here, but I'd like to go with you into heaven. And thus he said, the fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all the other kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, trample it, and break it in pieces. The 10 horns are 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom, and in other words, a resurrection here of that Roman Empire, and another shall rise after them. So the 10 kings, the 10 countries will be in place. Once they're in place in that condition, then this Antichrist will rise after them. He shall be different from the first ones. He'll subdue 3 of the kings and take over. By virtue of that, he shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. So he'll come against every vestige on planet Earth of the worship of God. And that spirit is already at work in the world. They take the 10 Commandments out of everywhere, and now you got to fight to have a nativity scene. It's this whole trip. And it's just a prelude to what's going to happen. He is going to remove from the face of the earth anything religious or having to do with the true and the living God, or that doesn't have to do with the worship of Him. That's what He's going to be really into. And so He'll take and remove all of these things that have to do with religious times and religious law. And then the saints shall be given into His hand for a time and times and half a time. A time is what? 1 year. Times, that's 2 years. Half a time is half a year. You add it all up, you have 3.5 years in which the Antichrist is going to pour his full fury out upon the earth. The Great Tribulation is a period. The tribulation period is a 7-year period. But the first 3.5 years, let's see, you're on the right, you read left. Anyway, those who say this is the first 3.5 years. Let's just deal with it. No, is that good? You guys understand? Got it? Okay. So you have the first 3.5 years is going to be, they're going to go, boy, I can't believe it. All we had to do was get rid of those dumb Christians. The whole world is just going to go absolutely flawlessly. It's going to go so great. And then at that halfway point, all of a sudden, literally all hell breaks loose on planet Earth. And God pours His judgment out on the hell that's raining on this earth, and it just becomes a disaster. But technically, when you read the materials on all of this, when they talk about the Great Tribulation, it's referring to that final 3.5 years, which is spoken of here. And all through later in Daniel, we'll see it also in Revelation. You see the 1,260 days, which is also a reference to 3.5 years. If you add it all out, 3.5 years spoken of continually, speaking of the time in which this Antichrist will wreak his havoc. But the court shall be seated, and they shall take away his dominion to consume and destroy it forever. And then the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey Him. In other words, He wins. We are on the winning side. And so that's good to know. Daniel needed to know it. But notice the effect that all of this had on Daniel. This was the end of my account. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly troubled me, and my countenance changed, but I kept the matter in my heart. When he received this whole vision and the interpretation of his vision, his whole mind became troubled, and it's greatly troubled. His countenance changed. In other words, his color changed. We're going to see later that he became physically ill at the receiving of some of these visions. They were so intense upon him physically. I have a suspicion, and this isn't any kind of gospel, truth related to Daniel, but I do have a suspicion that despite the image that he interpreted for Nebuchadnezzar there in Daniel chapter 2 of this series of Gentile kingdoms, that there was hope in his heart that at the end of the 70 years that Jeremiah had spoken of the Babylonian Empire, that the Jews would turn as a nation back to God, and that God would then use that turning back to Him as an occasion to set up His kingdom. When this is all laid out to Daniel, he realizes it's going to get worse before it gets better, and it's going to get much worse before it gets better. And so it physically affected him. When we look at the Scriptures, one of the things that we don't like to see and we don't like to know in the natural is that it is highly likely that it is going to get much worse before it gets better on planet Earth for a child of God. But the key here is that the rebellion of man is going to come to an end. When the Lord has us praying on a daily basis, you think of how often this prayer goes up to the Lord every day from every corner of the world. Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. He never has us pray anything vain. And He has us praying that prayer because He is going to do it. He's going to establish His kingdom upon this earth. He's going to answer that prayer